Happy Friday, Baylor College of Medicine and friends of Baylor. Well, I'm back from vacation, and I have one piece of advice for you. Never blindside your sister with a picture from Mexico's beaches when she's in cold, rainy New York. It doesn't work well. So what was her way to get back at me? She sent me a zillion questions to answer, and so it's time for Q&A and me digging myself out of a hole for going on a vacation that I didn't tell her about. Anyway, so my favorite question, of course, is from everybody. Do you think China is accurately testing or accurately reporting results of COVID? Are you kidding me? Of course they're not. I mean, it is hilarious. If you look at the reports, it's like nothing going on, but China has got the biggest surge of cases anywhere, which is a real problem for the rest of us because obviously any place where there's lots of replication, there are going to be new mutants, and I would expect that there'll be new mutants coming from China pretty soon. If you look at the real reporting data, Japan is actually still in the lead. Japan's had a big spike, but it looks like it's beginning to come down at the start of the New Year, so that's good for them. So here's some interesting questions. Why is testing positivity that everybody's reporting nationally going up, but cases are not? Well, there's a couple of possibilities on that. First of all, around the holidays, a lot of the reporting agencies don't get the data in time, and so we may be lagging because of the holidays. The other thing is a lot of people are being admitted to hospitals for other things and are testing positive for COVID without symptoms, and that's because we probably have generalized immunity in the country, and so there's a lot more people showing up with sort of asymptomatic COVID, and I think that's one other possibility. A better and more accurate index of what's going on is to look at hospitalizations. And if you look at hospitalizations, for example, in the Texas Medical Center, we have pretty good numbers. Here's our positivity rate on hospitalizations. It's already up to about 8%. So you can see that's a good example of where the testing positivity is going up. But when you look at case numbers nationally, it's pretty flat. So they're not going up quite as fast. And if you look at our hospitalizations, as I said, a better indicator than case numbers. In the TMC, case numbers are beginning to rise, as you can see, and hospitalizations, are beginning to rise. And nationally, hospitalizations are also beginning to go up. Here's a good example, but particularly in the over 70-year-old age group. So it's beginning to look like more and more like other respiratory diseases where you have cases going up, and hospitalizations going up, mostly in the older age group. So another good question, if wastewater is going up, as I've been talking about all along, shouldn't cases be going up too? Yes, and again, it's hard to explain. Hospitalizations are going up. I'm sure case numbers are going up but are underreported. That's the main problem. But with wastewater, it's not a one-to-one relationship. So for example, people with high viral burdens, in other words, have large amounts of virus in them, maybe excreting a lot of virus. That'll appear in wastewater as an increase, but may only be one or two individuals. Now, you assume when you look at the entire city, increasing wastewater numbers do generally reflect case numbers, but it's not a one-to-one relationship. The good news is if you look nationally, the CDC is reporting, you can see it's kind of flat right now. The wastewater data isn't continuing to go up. But when we look at Houston, unfortunately, it does look like it's continuing to go up. And again, when I've shown you the numbers across the country, the Northeast was having an increase in case numbers, so was the West and Midwest. The Southeast was very low in COVID, but is beginning now to go up, and we're beginning to see more and more cases of COVID, and as long as that wastewater number continues to go up, I think we'll continue to do it. We'll continue to see more cases. So here's a really good question, and it's interesting. Why are there so many variants now when before there'd be one variant that dominated? And this really speaks to the concept of selection. So viruses evolve based on selective pressures. Now, early on, that selective pressure was infectivity. So each variant came along was more infectious and so infected more people. That was the selective pressure. But when you see a bunch of variants that are not taking over, then it means there's not the same selective pressure. So remember, every time the virus replicates, it generates a bunch of mutations. And so in a region where there's a lot of viral replication, there are going to be a bunch of mutations. But unless there's selective pressure for one of those, they'll just continue to accumulate and sit there. Interestingly enough, one is beginning to step up, which is XBB 1.5. And what happens early on, I think, and you'll see this in China, is the selective pressure is mostly infectivity, who infects the most. But once the country has a lot of immunity, so either through vaccination or infection like our country, then the next selective pressure is more likely to be immune escape. And that is what we're seeing with the XBB 1.5. And this is beginning to go up in New York State. We were talking about, in New York and Northeast going up. It's mostly by this XBB 1.5, and it is tied to a mutation in the receptor binding domain that is associated with immune escape. And if you look at nationally, same thing is happening. This dark blue XBB 1.5 is beginning to dominate. It's now 40.5% of all infections. And if you look at that combined with two of the BQ1 and BQ11, that makes up almost 85% of the variants. So it's beginning to focus mostly on this XBB 1.5. And just to remind you, we talked about this about a few months ago. This is the lineage tree, and you can see the distances here represent farther genetic diversity. So the farther away, the more genetically diverse there are. This branch is Omicron, so it is very distinct from the Alpha and Delta Gamma variants in the beginning. And remember, think back to when Omicron first emerged, it was over 20 individual mutations, and we thought it was probably an immune-compromised host in South Africa that started that. Well, that whole lineage has really diverged pretty substantially from the original ones. But this XBB branch was originally identified in Singapore, and you can see the BA2 split off, and the XBB represents a recombination of two BA2 variants. The BQ, the other ones that are appearing now, the BQ variants, were originally identified in the United Kingdom. So very interesting. You can see how much now there's been a deviation or variance from the original strains. And these are all Omicron lineages. Someone asked, how are we doing in Texas and Harris County? Well, Texas remains pretty low. Harris County right now is a medium risk with about 80 cases per 100,000 and about 11 hospitalizations. Our friends in Dimmitt County remain pretty low. Here's a really interesting question. I received my Omicron bivalent as soon as it became available. When will I need my next booster? We don't know yet. We'll have to wait and see when immunity begins to wane. My guess is in 9 to 12 months we'll need another booster. Here's an unfortunate one. Do you think we'll be going back to wearing masks for air travel? Well, the CDC lifted the order requiring air travel in April, remember, of this year, or of 2022. And it's going to take a large resurgence of cases for, I think, to be a requirement to resume masks. I think it'll be an elective issue for a long time. RSV is beginning to come down. Flu hopefully will begin to come down, even though COVID's going up a little. When I traveled to Mexico, almost no one was wearing a mask. How accurate are at-home COVID tests? Actually, the at-home COVID tests are about 80% accurate, depending on the timing, but are 80% accurate and does detect all of the Omicron variants. Here's a good one. How long are you contagious after getting COVID? Usually it's somewhere between 5 and 10 days, but your infectiousness, your ability to infect other people begins to wane after about 5 days. How long should you be quarantined after COVID exposure? The CDC says 5 days and then another 5 days with masks. I personally sort of follow that 5 days, but I started testing antigen, using the antigen test, and when I hit 7 days and I was antigen negative, I felt like you're no longer infectious when your antigen capture test is negative. How long does COVID last? For most people, it's a fairly limited 5 to 10 days, but long COVID can last for months. And you remember we've talked about this, almost 20% of the population has long COVID symptoms, and including myself, I have a persistent cough. Should you test after COVID exposure? Well, if you're concerned about infecting other people, then the best thing people is to get the PCR. If you're PCR negative, it should be okay. The antigen test is good, but it takes 2 to 3 days to be positive. So if you test early, you might be negative by antigen and positive by PCR. Here was an interesting nutrition question. Can you discuss evidence-based nutrition interventions to help prevent illness in children and adults, like elderberry, vitamin C, zinc, vitamin D? This is obviously in addition to the appropriate vaccinations. So that's a really good question. There's not a lot of evidence. There have been many, many studies showing deficiency of individual nutrients can lead to immune, or at least a decrease in immune response. Animal studies have shown that a deficiency in zinc, selenium, iron, copper, folic acid, vitamins A, B, C, D, and E all can lead to reduced immune responses, but there are very few studies that show that a supplement, if you're normal, adds to any immune benefit. So it's really, if you're exposed to the virus, that's the most important thing. And the best protection is to get vaccinated and be up to date with your vaccinations. This is an interesting one for China. If you've never had COVID, are you more susceptible to variants? Well, if you start saying who's the most susceptible, individuals, let's put it the other way. Who's got the most protection? Well, if you've been vaccinated and infected, you have the greatest immune response to the virus. If you've just been vaccinated but not infected, you're kind of second level. If you are not vaccinated but have been infected, you're sort of third tier. And at the very bottom are those who've never been vaccinated, never infected. And, unfortunately, those people, and particularly in China, who have not been vaccinated, are very, very susceptible. Luckily, in the U.S. now, over 90% of the people have either been vaccinated and infected or vaccinated. So we're in much better shape than a country like China. Now, there's no benefit. There's no clear, evidence that we won't be at risk in the future for future variants. But the best way to be protected is to stay up to date with your vaccinations. Here was an interesting one. Somebody heard that is there a risk for hearing loss after COVID vaccination? That was sort of floated out there. But there have now been two fairly large studies, one in this country and one in Europe, that shows that there's no relationship with hearing loss and vaccination. I'm going to finish with a couple of flu questions that came up. This is I feel sorry for this person. I had a flu shot in the beginning of August, and I went on a cruise 2 weeks ago, November 18th, and then I got the flu, and it was type A variant, and I had full-blown symptoms. First, since I got the vaccine, I thought I'd been immune, or at least not get it as severely. And second, I thought, and there's Billy getting a cough. The second could have variant for another country caused me to be infected. So I'm going to declare this person as officially the unluckiest person in the world. They got the vaccine on time. The vaccine is a perfect match, and yet they got influenza A while being, out there. But you have to remember the vaccine is only 65% protective. And then the other thing is, when you say you had full-blown flu, what do you mean by that? Because full-blown flu is 3 to 5 days of incredibly severe fevers, unable to get out of bed. The disease often lasts 10 days to 14 days. When you get flu after being vaccinated, usually it's a couple of days of fever and you're better by 5 days. That's not full-blown flu. So my guess is you were unlucky in that you got the flu because it's only 65% effective, but I bet you didn't have full-blown flu, but I don't know. Okay, one last question. My husband turned 65 and he choice of flu vaccines. He's an active retired man, a little overweight, as we all are, and on blood pressure medication. Any thoughts on this subject? Yeah, the main thing is, in the past you had a choice between a trivalent and quadrivalent, but this year all the vaccines are quadrivalent. You should get a high-dose quadrivalent vaccine. That will be the most effective in those over the age of 65. So I hope that satisfies my sister and all the questions she had while I was on vacation. Lots of good stuff happening. I'll be reviewing all the numbers next week in the country and nation and worldwide. So have a great weekend. Happy New Year, and I can't wait to see you next week.